with you right now. Well, we'll go ahead and get rolling today since it is 6 o'clock or 6 o'clock Eastern time. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Dwayne Brejak. I am the Executive Director for the Michigan chapter of NASW, and I have been one of the conveners of this National Student Series over the last year and a half. We are so happy to have you here for our January session on preparing for your early career. We have a fabulous panel for you all today to learn a little bit more about how to start out in social work, what different career trajectories have looked like, the beginnings of a social work career, how that has, what that looks like today. And we'll have a little bit of time at the end for breakout rooms. So kind of how the flow will go is we will have a panel discussion until about 7 o'clock for about the first hour. And then the last half an hour, we will break out into rooms, and we'll let you choose what kind of topic area or career area you're most interested in to have a little bit more one-on-one conversation with these wonderful professionals we have with us today. I will drop some resources in the chat today. We've got a whole series of upcoming events through NASW specifically focused on student engagement. So we hope to see you at those. The My NASW student community is also a really wonderful resource as we think about networking and connecting across the field. Our panelists and I were talking about where we're from today. We really cover the entire United States, and we have even more states covered in our attendance today, which is really fabulous. And this is a really good and unique way to get connected to each other. So please feel free to share your contact information in the chat if you're comfortable, your LinkedIn profiles, and get connected on the national My NASW platform whenever possible. I would like to introduce you to my counterpart at the national office, the fabulous Jen Watt, who is your Senior Director of Membership and Marketing with the National NASW, who's going to kind of get us kicked off for today.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Dwayne. So very briefly, I am greeting you from Washington, D.C. Not really. I'm in Silver Spring, Maryland, outside of D.C., but the national office is proud to work with Dwayne on hosting this student series. And today, your panelists are coming all from the specialty practice sections, which is hosted at the national office. The specialty practice sections cover 11 areas of practice specialty and offer a fantastic wealth of resources in materials, articles, and webinars each year. And so I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves in just a moment, but I also want to put in a quick plug. And I know, Dwayne, you said you are posting in the resources, but the virtual career fair is coming up at the end of this month. It is free to all job seekers at all stages of their career. And we invite you to join the other hundreds of folks who've registered. We've got dozens and dozens of employers already signed up. It's a great way for you to talk to employers from the comfort of your Zoom and get to schedule appointments and also practice your skills. So I'm going to take us back to the group, and I'm going to ask our folks to introduce themselves by starting with Antonio.
Thanks so much, Jen. Good evening, everyone. I'm Antonio Ruberto Jr. I'm the chair of the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Other Drugs Specialty Practice Section Committee. I live in New York City. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and credentialed alcoholism and substance abuse counselor here in New York State. My full-time role is as the Senior Director of Behavioral Health at the New York City Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center. In that role, I oversee all of our adult and youth, which is ages 13 and up, substance use and mental health programming. I use all pronouns.
Robert, you want to go ahead?
Yes, thank you, Jennifer, and thank you, Dwayne, for putting this together. I'm really excited to be here and to be in the company. Luckily, I get to go first because some of these I don't want to follow, the other panelists. So, so it sort of builds up as we go along. But I'm Robert Lucio. I'm an associate professor at St. Leo University in graduate social work, but I'm also the chair for the school social work specialty practice section. I'm an LCSW, and I spent 15 years in the school district as a school social worker, and I'm currently also engaged with some work with NASW and the Director of Public Policy, Sarah Butts, and we can talk about that a little bit later. I'm also actively with my state association for the Florida Association of School Social Workers, and I sit as the Advocacy and Legislative Action Committee Chair for the School Social Work Association of America.
That's great. Tara?
Hello, welcome everybody. I am the chair of the Social and Economic Justice and Peace Section Committee. I am from Kansas, right smack dab in the middle, and I have a private practice here in Topeka, Kansas. I also have a nonprofit organization that provides holistic wellness to communities of color, low income and low access communities. I am also an adjunct professor, and I serve on many, many boards here in the state that focus on addressing the needs of families and children in Kansas.
Tina? Thank you, Tara.
Yes. Hello, I'm Tina Paddock. I am here out in California where it stopped raining. We're drying out a little bit. As you can see, I actually am an associate professor at the USC Suzanne DeVore Peck School of Social Work. I'm not actually in front of my building. You can see a little bit where my office is. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. In my role at USC, I oversee all our practicums for our students, in particular those related to mental health and public child welfare. I got my beginnings in public child welfare, and right now I chair the child welfare specialty section for NASW. So thank you so much for inviting me, Jennifer and Dwayne, today.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. We are so excited to have your expertise and your knowledge that you're going to, I know, impart on us today. As folks have questions, as folks are talking, please feel free to type those into the chat box today, or when we get to a little bit more free flow conversation later, feel free to use the raise hand feature in the reactions tab. I forgot to mention, I'm from Michigan. This is not my back window right now, although it feels like it outside. It's really cold. So I'm definitely jealous of you folks on the West Coast and in Hawaii right now. But let's get started for today. So we wanted to, today's topic is really about early social work careers. And we would love to hear from each of you, how did you start your social work career? And was it the trajectory you thought you would be starting when you went into your social work program? And I'll just go in alphabetical order, at least to start. And Antonio.
Thanks, Dwayne. It's a great question, and I'll try to answer it relatively briefly because I think most of us can probably tell a bit of a tale at the start of our careers. So I actually went back to social work school at age 30. And had wanted to do counseling work in undergrad, and then after college ended up working retail, and then through networking at retail, ended up at a university office here in the city, not a social work office, but another office. And through there discovered the social work field through some colleagues, and ended up applying for the program at the school I was working at, and did that over 3 years, had the second and third year being internship years. And my final year internship was at the organization I work at now, which I had, even though I lived in New York City and gone to college here, had not really interacted with very much until my internship, and really had a great experience. And, had the opportunity when the internship was ending that May. It was an open position that some of the supervisors at the time thought I was a fit for. They had me apply. I was able to, start that role pretty much right after graduation. I was doing crystal meth prevention counseling, which essentially was short-term counseling using harm reduction principles for, LGBT people dealing with crystal meth addiction, and also outreach to the community through educational kind of brochures and pamphlets about substances in general, trying to connect people to services both at our agency and others. So I had like an outreach team and did some community organizing through that grant as well. So did that for a little over a year. Till the market crashed in 2008, and they weren't sure if my position would continue to be funded. So I started looking for something a little bit more firm for myself, and I ended up at a substance use clinic out in Long Island, which is a suburb of New York City for folks that aren't from the area, and was at a substance use clinic and basically utilized that space for a lot of growth, a lot of knowledge learning, where I got my clinical hours, where I got my CASEC hours. Was there a little over 3 years. And I'll stop there because I can go into my whole career, but this is about the early parts of the career. I want to give the other panelists a chance as well to talk, but that was kind of the start from there.
Excellent. I mean, it sounds like your story is your internship led to a job that you actually enjoyed, right? So, I mean, I think that that's a good lesson too, to talk about like the role of an internship, and you know, sometimes it leads people to be like, no, this is not my right area of social work, or yeah, this reaffirms my passion in this area. That's fabulous.
Absolutely, yeah. I loved my first year internship, but it was doing work and with a population that I didn't enjoy as much as some other populations and areas. So definitely gave me a good experience, but wasn't somewhere I would want to work most likely.
Excellent. Robert, what about you?
So I know the question was partly, right, like, did this trajectory end up where I thought it would be? And the answer is absolutely not, right? In every step of the phase. And, you know, and so when I was in high school, I hadn't even, to be truthful, thought of social work. I was actually an engineering student, and finished like 3/4 of my engineering degree. I did, like, you know, organic chemistry. I did, you know, Calc 1, 2, and 3. And I started working in an engineering place and I hated it. And so I was like, well, I need to do something else, right? And so, you know, so I searched around and I ended up with, they actually didn't offer social work at the school I was at, but they offered in, you know, in grad schools. And oddly enough, I was in a band, and the drummer in the band was a social worker. And I thought, well, you know, sounds like what he does is pretty interesting. I think I'll be a social worker. And so I applied to grad school. It's funny, you know, you think back now, and it turns out he was a horrible social worker, right? Because, like, you know, when you think about his stories he would tell, they were not very good, but that's all I had at the time, right? You didn't know any better. So this was in the time, so some of you guys are gonna have to Google pagers, right? But, like, you know, in the time of pagers, he'd get the page and he'd be like, oh, this is the 3rd page, it must be important, right? You know, like, you'd think, well, first page, you should answer this, right? So you learn those things, but so my trajectory was not at all. So I had no social work experience. And so I was a 2-year student. I went to, you know, grad school. And even my internships were completely, like, my first internship I applied for, I didn't have enough experience to even get the first internship, they said. And I'm like, it's an internship where you're supposed to get experience. So, you know, so I ended up at this place where they couldn't place everybody. They sent you there. So it was like 25 of us at this placement, and adult mental health, which was not what I ever ended up in anyway. And then I did my second internship at a VA hospital in Charleston. But wasn't my calling. And so I never worked with kids. I had one job offer in St. Pete. So I moved back to Florida, and was very, very fortunate, to be honest. I was at a place that made us do one-way mirror training for probably 4 months before they even let us see a client. So we did solution-oriented narrative training. I got to meet Insu when she was still alive, and Steve DeShazer in person. And so it's just very, very fortunate. Suffice to say, I ended up working as a contract person for them in a school. And I was in a meeting, and it was a Friday afternoon. And mind you, when you do community mental health, it's all billable hours. And, you know, and so I still had, like, you know, I was going to be working till 10 o'clock that night. And I'm in the meeting, we're talking about a student, and one of the school social workers looks up and says, it's 12:30 on Friday, our day's over, we'll pick this meeting up on Monday. And I thought to myself, I've got another 8 hours of work and they are done. I'm like, I am in the wrong field. So the next day on the Monday, I'm like, hook me up with your supervisor. And so I called the supervisor, and they had 2 positions open. One was in students who have been expelled, and one was in a teen parenting program. So running a teen parenting program. And so I said, you know, I'd like to hear more about the teen parent program. And she said, well, you know, we have this program for expelled students. I said, well, I heard that, but I'd like to hear more about the teen parent program. And about the 3rd time of, we have this expelled student program, I finally got into the teen parent program, and I stayed there for 15 years. So it was really an interesting journey to work with teen moms and dads. I became childbirth certified. And so that was sort of my early career. And I say, and we'll talk about this later on, is networking is extremely critical. So getting to know the social workers and really speaking to the school social workers really gave me, otherwise I wouldn't have been able to, because I'm certain when I called their supervisor, the first thing she did was call them and say, what do you think of this person? So that's how I ended up in school social work, was just, by, I don't want to say chance. I'd never worked with kids before, being open to that. And I think, Antonio spoke to this idea that our skills are applicable everywhere we go. And, and those skills really allow us to have a job in so many settings, and which is the beauty of social work, is you can change careers without having to change skills or go back to school. You just change populations. And so that's how I ended up in school social work. I got my doctorate, and then I did a calculation of how long it would, like with my raise in the school district. I think it was like 122 years I'd have to keep working in the school district to pay off my doctorate. So then I left the school and went and ended up in higher ed. So that was sort of where I am today. But that was sort of my journey from early career, and obviously more stuff going on, and we'll share more later as we go.
122 years. That's some good data to find, though, to make sure.
Yeah.
You're not
So if you're going to get your doctorate, no, don't work in the school district to stay to pay it off. So.
Well, and there's a lot of affirmation in the chat too of folks who came into social work from a different discipline, or how maybe other transferable skills then lead into social work skills, whether that be engineering, or I see lots of art, drama, music, how those things also can interplay within your social work degree. And then lots of folks coming back into social work after maybe 20 years out from school. And that's I think what makes social work great and unique too, is we do have a lot of folks who are coming after lived experience and finding that this is the path after being in maybe a different unrelated field for a while. Now, Cara, I'm guessing you did not start out in private practice right after school. What was your trajectory like?
So actually, I was 2 classes away from an undergraduate degree in criminal justice. And my son was diagnosed with autism. And getting to that diagnosis was probably one of the most challenging paths that I'd ever taken. And literally, as I was walking out the door from finally getting that diagnosis, there was a family walking into the school having the same struggle. And I said to myself, if my struggle was complicated as a single parent, and there's 2 of them, there have to be more people in this fight to help parents get, it shouldn't be this difficult. So I was working at the college that I was attending. I went to the registrar's office and changed my degree to social work. I literally went back to work and changed my degree to social work. Doing what I'm doing right now was not what I had in mind. When I was in grad school, I said, I'm going to graduate and I'm going to sit in an office and do therapy all day. That's what I'm going to do. But my last semester, I took a policy class, and we had to dissect a bill, figure out how it impacted families, and then argue for or against that bill. And my professor said there were 3 of us who for whatever reason were late to class, and so they stuck us together, and we didn't get to choose who we were working with. And he said, the 3 of you wrote the best paper I've ever seen in my entire time of teaching this class. I think that you should go during comments and present your paper. We didn't get to do it because we would have had to miss class in order to do it. But something about that experience led to me leaving. After graduation, my very first job was a hybrid case manager therapist. I was a clinical social worker in the community, working directly with families. So I literally was doing everything that a community mental health center did in one person. I would meet a family, do the intake, do the resources and the therapy while sitting in their home, in the homeless shelter, wherever I found them. That's what I would do in the community. And that's what I do now in my private practice and in my nonprofit. I do all of that right now. But it's not as simple because of policy and if you're practicing or working with families, you know, it gets complicated because of laws and policies and rules and regulations. And I've never sat in an office and did therapy. I've been doing this since 2014, and I've never sat in an office and done therapy. All I do is work with families and advocate and fight against policy and challenge laws and all of these things. So the trajectory that I plan for myself to sit in the office all day and do therapy from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. has never, ever happened, ever. So I want to say, for those of you who are still in school, don't put yourself in a box, because it'll be boring, number one. And you will dim your passion for being a social worker, number two. And you won't have any fun, number three. If you put yourself in that narrow box, it just will suck the life out of you. If I wasn't doing this, I do tell people all the time, if I was not doing something that I love like this, working with families, I would probably be a sports therapist and work with athletic teams. Like we have the Kansas City Chiefs, I would be the social worker for their team. I'm not a Chiefs fan, and that's probably why I would be really, really good at it, because I wouldn't be like all excited to go to work and work with them, because I wouldn't be starstruck. I would do my job and I would be great at it, but I love sports, but I'm not a Chiefs fan. So I could really get in and work with the teams and work with the families and work with the players, but I wouldn't be so excited to be with them. I mean, if like the Tampa Bay Buccaneers came in, I would be excited, but I wouldn't be starstruck for the Chiefs. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. And shout out to all the macro classes out there, changing people's perceptions on policy. I'm a macro licensed social worker, so I love that. I went to social work for legislative engagement. And I love even talking about things like sports social work and these non-traditional paths that are becoming more common to go into, right? And again, where a social work degree can be so valuable in 2023 is everybody wants us and everybody needs us. Some of it is going to be, we'll talk about maybe marketing yourself in a little bit. But let's finish up our early conversations with Tina. Did you envision yourself back at a university or a school of social work after you graduated?
No. And thank you to all the presenters today. I'm taking little notes here with words of wisdom. It's so helpful. But no, I didn't envision myself working in higher education. I think for me, I think a lot of was just keeping my eyes open for different experiences, not kind of pigeonholing myself into a certain area, and then really networking. And, I started out my career after I got my BA. I got my BA in psychology, and where I went undergrad, they didn't have a social work degree. So I think I kind of put together a social work degree on my own without even knowing it. So I majored in psychology, but I minored in government because I was very interested in the psychology piece, as well as the, like yourself, Dwayne, the legislative, the macro piece. And I also was really interested in working with children who had been abused or neglected. And so when I graduated, I actually ended up working in the county. I worked for the Department of Children and Family Services. That was our public child welfare agency. And I ended up coordinating their subsidized childcare program for those that were receiving childcare services. And then I also worked in the medical placement unit with children who had medical as well as other sorts of challenges where they needed like specific, foster care placements and so forth. And then there I met a wonderful lady. I'm going to say her name. I don't think she's here, but Barbara Lane, and she ended up being a mentor to me. And we just kind of met when she became my supervisor, and she had her master's in social work. And she said, Tina, you should go back and get your master's in social work. So I thought, well, maybe I'll go back and get my PhD in psychology and clinical psychology and this and that. I didn't really want to get a doctorate at that time and go back to school for that long, but she told me all about social work, and she was a licensed clinical social worker, and really, helped me to kind of make that decision to go back and get my master's in social work at the other school across town, UCLA. So I did that, and I actually worked for a couple of years outside of undergrad before I went back to get my master's. And when I was there, again, I think one thing that I love about social work is that you can do so much with it in terms of doing the direct practice, and also be involved in the policy pieces too, and the macro pieces, because I really have interest in both areas. And so I went back to UCLA and I got my master's, and then I ended up working at a small community mental health center, working specifically with children and families that were referred from DCFS, the Department of Children and Family Services. So it was nice that I had that early experience at DCFS. And then, but I did that just for a few years and got my licensing hours. I found for myself, I was working primarily with very young children that had been sexually abused, did a lot of work in play therapy, and also worked with families and adoptive families, foster families, a program called Family Preservation. But I found that I really needed to have a little time away from doing the direct clinical practice. I think for me at that time, I had a hard time kind of separating myself, not taking it home. I needed a little bit of a break. And so that's when I went into more kind of administrative, but still really my passion with public child welfare. I worked for a program called Parents Anonymous, and it's a national nonprofit. I never heard of it. I found the job again through networking. I actually joined NASW California and became involved with some committees and regional things. And I met a lovely lady by the name of Peggy Polinsky, who connected me to Parents Anonymous and a job there. So it was through that connection, and then their national nonprofit that does works in partnership with parents to create support groups to prevent child abuse and to also strengthen families. And so I did that for a number of years. And then through another connection, I ended up going in, working with those with developmental disabilities and delays at South Central Los Angeles Regional Center, which I also found that position through networking, because early on in my career, I worked with children on the autism spectrum. And so I just went in a completely different direction where I was working again, mostly with adults. So, even though I saw myself, mostly child welfare, this position became available to be the wellness program manager. And I was able to kind of transition those skills into that position. Had another job working as the director of prevention and early intervention at a small nonprofit, going back to some of my earlier child welfare interests. And now I'm at USC, and I've been able to combine a lot of my interests in terms of just my in the work that I do, as well as supporting students. So I think one thing that I learned is just really, keeping an open mind, networking. Even though I'm not a person that likes a lot of change, that's really hard for me. I've had to learn to try to be more comfortable with change. Moving to different organizations has been really helpful to me. And you can do both clinical and the policy administrative pieces. So yeah, it's a little bit about my story.
Well, that's a great segue into kind of our next conversation. And if we had like social work bingo cards, I'm pretty sure everyone would already have bingos of all the different career choices you could possibly have just from the 4A. I mean, it really is incredible to hear from social workers. And one piece of advice that I give to students is like, talk to as many social workers as you can, because people, part of our title is social, right? So it means we have to connect and be networked, whether that is in our specific area. But I also say in the field is really important to be networked and to learn why people went into social work and how that has changed their career trajectory over time, because you really can ping from lots of different places. And you're seeing, especially in the last few years, with how the shifting landscape of social services have worked, telehealth coverage, access to technology. There's many different sorts of ways to practice social work, even than we had 5 to 10 years from now, which is pretty exciting. So you talked, Tina, a little bit about some of advice that I think you all did about advice, what you'd give to new social workers starting your career. I heard listen to yourself, like burnout happens in jobs. It's real. We talk about it, but like listen to your body and know when it might be time to switch something, or maybe it's staying within the organization, but doing a different sort of task that maybe is less emotionally burdensome. Or if you find something that you really don't like to do, that's where supervision can really be helpful. But I'm curious from the panel, what other advice would you give to social workers starting out their career? What should they be asking, and what should they looking out for? And this is open for anybody.
One of the things that I did is found mentors outside of social work. Before I left the community mental health center, I have 4 mentors in Texas because that's where I started school. 2 of them are not social workers. They are marriage and family therapists, and they are counselors, licensed counselors. So not that not being a social worker isn't a great thing, but find mentors who have characteristics that you admire as helping professionals, because we're multifaceted. Social work is multifaceted, so you need to glean from all of that so that you can pull all of that in. We're eclectic. Social work is eclectic, so you want to have all of those components. And I have mentors here in Kansas. I have mentors in Texas. I have mentors in Georgia. I have mentors in North Carolina. I'm 52. I have mentors who are older than me. I have mentors who are younger than me, because I need to have all of that experience that feeds into me so that I can learn. I have one of my interns here. She's actually on the call. We're going to meet, and I'm going to get her impression of this call, because I need to learn from her just as much as she needs to learn from me. So you're never too old or too young to give or receive. So it's a continual process.
Yeah, I love that. One of the other exercises that folks can do to kind of set those networks, especially if you can identify like where are you missing somebody or something, is doing your own personal board of directors is one of the exercises I like, or creating your pie, right? And what are the key pieces in your professional life, your personal life, and where may you need some additional assistance or guidance? And by being able to identify those gaps can really be helpful in terms of especially early career and those transition points when you're figuring out, okay, I'm ready to move into a new role or a new aspect, is taking that time to reflect and really potentially use a mentor to go through that. Yeah, other pieces of advice from our panel.
Dwayne, one thing that I found really helpful, especially when I was early on in my career, and again, I may be a little biased, but was joining my region. In California, we have regions of NASW, and back then we didn't have Facebook, Instagram, all those ways, social media to connect. So we didn't have Zoom, but they had like different regional meetings and so forth, where we'd meet at like a restaurant or a place. And I can tell you, it was so interesting. We always have people that were moving from different states going to these meetings, or people that are students or who have graduated, but I found that just for networking was so helpful. That really helped me probably get, as I look back in my career, at least 2 or 3 jobs that I was in was through that networking. Also, as a professor in practicum education or field education department, to reach out to professors. I mean, I encourage my students to reach out to me, for connections, for ideas, for references. I mean, just to reach out, because I think that for me, I had a lot of people in my life that really helped me, and I want to continue that, that support, because we're all in this together. So those two things are some bits of advice. But I really like Tara's advice too. That's great. Maybe I'll look at that for my next job, huh? Okay, great. Thank you.
I can go next, Wayne. Yeah, I would just kind of a little bit what both Tara and Tina were saying is keeping an open mind. I also thought I was just going to do counseling. Not that there's anything wrong with being a therapist or doing that full time, but that was really what I thought I was going to do. Got into my internships, was able to apply skills, as I think you noted, from non-social work jobs. So like things I had learned in retail management, things I had learned in program management at the school I worked at, the university I worked at, was applicable to both my direct service work as well as the work as I took on more administrative tasks leading to my current role. So really like keeping an open mind around like what your career can actually look like. Kind of tied to that also is within your comfort level, like pushing yourself a little bit. So I was someone who never was really thrilled with doing large presentations or speaking in front of folks, which is interesting since we're on here tonight with probably hundreds of folks. But that was something that early on in my career, both pre-social work and in some of my early jobs in social work, was doing trainings and workshops and really kind of pushing through that discomfort of speaking in front of folks, of learning how to present and so on and so forth. And it worked out for me at different times in my career. I've had some training courses that I've done for different other agencies outside of the one I work for. Every now and again it comes up where they're like, oh, can you do a class? And I'll do that for a few hours, and it's a little extra money, which I think most of us could use at most times, but also just something I enjoy doing and kind of like keeps me sharp. So I think thinking about like not saying no to things that maybe aren't what you want to do might be something that's good. And something I always emphasize, and I know there's at least one intern from the center that's on here tonight, and I've been at the center a long time, and I started out there as an intern, is really the importance within organizations, whether it's you're starting your own, if you're working at an agency, even private practice, is documentation, having some, like, I hate to say business acumen, but I think that's the term. Like, you have to have some understanding of that. It's great. You need to know the clinical skills and the work with the with your client, with the community, but it's really the documentation and paperwork is important. I think that's part of why I was kind of like selected to potentially apply for that job when I first interned. Was I was known for doing my charting well at the time, and this was we had mostly paper charts at that point in early aughts, but that was something that I think helped me stand out amongst like the 10 or 12 interns that I was with, for example. And still is important to this day. It's important for all sorts of things, just both from a clinical perspective, but also from a revenue, a funding perspective, to keep programs going and continuing to serve the populations we work with.
And I'll echo, obviously, networking is, I think, extremely critical. And I think the part of that I would like to emphasize about it, though, because I think everyone's talked about it, is what it looks like. Because I think we talk about it a lot, but when you get into it, it's like, what does it really look like when you start to network, and how do you network, right? And so I would say, as a student, be engaged in everything you can be in. If there's a club you can be a part of, if there's legislative education and advocacy or lead days, be involved in those, be involved in the student clubs, be involved in NASW as a student. And it's not just the involvement, but if you go to a conference, I mean, I hate to say this, I love what I present, but I don't think that's the most important thing when you go to a conference. It's the people you meet there and talking to them after. We talked a little bit about this the other day, is your initial network, your sort of friend network, isn't going to get you that job. It's that secondary network of the person you meet at the conference who knows someone who says, oh, I might know somebody in this job. Because I promise you, you apply for a job and they know, they're going to call your school, they're going to call your old, it's just the sort of informal network. And if we can expand that secondary network, that is what networking is really about, is expanding that network. And just going at a conference and just say, to somebody after they present, great presentation. I'd love to hear more about this. Can I get your email address? Professors are pretty vain. We will hand them out immediately. And if you email us, like the first time someone emailed me and said, can I have a copy of your dissertation? I was like, oh my God, somebody who wants to read my dissertation that doesn't have to. I was like super excited, right? Like my wife had to read it. She didn't have a choice, right? She had to read it over and over, whether she wanted to. Like somebody actually reached out and said, I'd love to read this. I'm like, hey, let's talk on the phone. I will, I'm sure they were like, can we hang up now? I don't want to talk about it anymore. But, we crave those opportunities to be mentors. That's why we're here. And so I think the more you can reach out, I think it's extremely critical. I would also say, pay attention in class. I know this is going to be a funny thing as you're into, I think I slept through my policy class and now all I do is policy work, and so it was like, I wasn't interested in, and so I do a lot of consultation in school districts. And the number one comment I get, right, besides you were so fantastic and we'd love to have you come back, was, I wish I'd paid attention in my research class. Because it is so critical when you get into the field, you don't realize or know where you're going to end up. And those skills you learn now, to relearn them, it can be a challenge some days. And so I would say every class you have, even if it's not your favorite, embrace it and learn that skill set, because you never know. I had no clue I would end up doing policy work. I promise you, I thought I was going to do therapy work for the rest of my life. And now almost exclusively, I do policy work, right? That's all I do. I work with NASW, with SWA, and directly with legislators. And it's something I wish I had paid attention to a little bit more when I was in grad school. So, and then my last piece of advice would be, match your passion with your job. If you're into art, think about combining art therapy. If you're into stories and writing, think about narrative therapy. I look at what Tara did. It was a passion, right? I'm not going to let other families go through what I went through. And so often that is how we become leaders in those areas, is because it's so personal to us. So if it's something you love, see how you can marry it with social work, right? That's great opportunities to bring that together and love what you do, and to bring something that, and to me, that's what this field is about. We can bring so many things together. So those would be sort of my initial piece of advice.
Yeah, those are all really wonderful. And one other thing that I would add to the networking piece is, find the people that fill your cup, because social work is hard, right? Our jobs are hard. We're dealing with tough stuff, whether you're in the clinical or the macro space, and find the people who will give you energy and will listen to you. And sometimes that's not going to be in your immediate bubble. That might not be the people at your workplace. You may have to go to an outside supervisor or an outside network or an outside conference, whatever that may be, to find those people. And I think that goes back to, the larger you throw your net out, the more likely you're going to know who to go to when you need that thing, whatever that is at that time in your career. And that's how I kind of see, like, my role working at NASW is, I view us as the social workers for social workers. So when you all in the field need something, we should be that body you go to first to ask for it, whether that's a network or an advocate or a resource or a training, right? But again, how do you build that network? And there's a lot of ways to do that. So thank you for lots of that good advice on thinking about your first career. I'm going to flip that question a little bit. What are some maybe caution or red flags of things to be thinking about when you're starting your initial career? Are there things that you should be looking out for when you're applying for jobs that would be like, maybe this is not the place I should be working at? Or are there pieces to your own early career trajectory that you would give some advice on as maybe things to look out for?
I saw this today. Someone did an interview and the person that was interviewing them was eating lunch because they did not have time to stop for their lunch break. I wouldn't even do the interview. Don't do the interview with that person. They're giving you a clue of what the job is going to be like. If they're too busy to stop and eat lunch and they are interviewing you and eating lunch at the same time, don't walk, run. Seriously.
Yeah, pretty good advice. Anybody else have anything that comes to mind? Robert?
Yeah, I do. And I would say, social workers talk about self-care more than anybody else, and we're the absolute worst at doing it. Right. And so we can give great advice to clients. And I'd say even early in your career, set your boundaries on what's important to you. And I think, Dwayne, you talked a lot about, about finding your cup. I would also say that cup, if you're going to vent, is not your coworkers. Right. And so I think setting that professional boundary is find someone who will gladly listen to you, because sometimes we just need to vent, right? It's like, I had the worst day. I hate my boss. And then you're done and you're like, okay, I love my boss again. But in that moment, right, find that person who's going to listen to you and say, yeah, it sucks. And then you can go back and do your work. Because I think sometimes it's like we're surrounded by these coworkers. And at some point, right, people are looking out for themselves. Your boss is going to, and bosses don't tend to understand you're just venting. Right, they sometimes take it personally, and right, sometimes I just need to vent and say my bosses did the worst thing ever, and it really wasn't. But in that moment, I just need to get it out, and so it's having also a network of people you can just really set those boundaries with, though. So, and I think if we set them early, we're more likely to keep them. There's a great book that is Essentialism by Greg McNown, and it really speaks to setting those boundaries early, and the idea is that ultimately, if you don't do what's essential, everything that's not essential that you do takes away from your life mission. So it might only be 10 minutes here, but if it's 10 minutes every day, that may add up to a week, a year you're spending doing things that aren't important to you or aren't critical. And so it's a really fantastic sort of philosophy that we don't always live by. So I know we give great advice about how to do self-care. I'd say take it seriously from the beginning, by far.
And kind of piggybacking on what Robert said, and I'm looking at the chat a little bit. One thing that I found really helpful when I was doing direct practice work, and also early on in my career, was being in my own therapy. I think being in my own therapy brought me into social work in many ways, into the field of public child welfare. But I know that it can be expensive. I know that insurance doesn't always do the best at covering therapy, but anything that you can do, I know that was really helpful in terms of my self-care, especially when I was working, with children that had been sexually abused. That really, really helped me. I think also too is as much as possible, trusting your gut. I think Tara, that's a really good example, which you had. If that, person you're interviewing with, or it doesn't quite feel right, to just trust that. I know it's hard. I know early on in my career, I had to pay back student loans. I had a car loan. I was living in Southern California. It was less expensive than it is now, but still it was really hard. I didn't have a lot of family support, to help me with extras. I was single, so I know I felt a lot of pressure to get, I have to get that job. I have to get that job. And so, as much as possible, if you can kind of, sit with yourself about, certain things you might sense. I think some of the choices I made in my career, I think they ended up working out fine. I think I had to do some reframes in my thinking and so forth. Some jobs I left a little earlier than others. But I kind of look back and go, gosh, that was like a little red flag, but I think I wasn't looking at those red flags because I felt that pressure because of a lot of other factors going on in my life. I'm just hoping, it seems like right now, I'm hoping, at least we're seeing in California, a little increase in salaries for social workers. We're seeing more demand out there. So I'm hoping, we're also seeing that across the nation. So, that helps me a little bit, because I still think we need to work on the salaries for social workers, But anyway, that's my thoughts. I hope that's helpful.
I would echo some of that. I would say if the person isn't having lunch during their interview and you're at the end of the interview, ask folks in the interview how long they've worked there. Have those questions. They always say, like, do you have any questions? Have some questions that aren't maybe just about benefits. Not that those are important to know. But yeah, ask them how long they've worked there. Ask them what they like about working at the agency. Ask them a little, if it hasn't come up, ask them a little about the culture of the agency. Depending on the work you're going to be doing, ask them, like, do they have any sort of commitment or value system? Is there something related to race equity going on in their organization? Those are some like key questions that can really help you kind of see if you're a fit, or see really what their mission or what their commitment is, or if they're really holding by their mission, if you've seen it on their website, if they've talked about it. You want to be the right fit there. I think at the same time, I'm thinking of some of my early jobs, particularly the first job I had after my first job at the center where I interned. I enjoyed it. It was good work. I knew I wasn't going to work there long term fairly early on. I was very much committed to the job I was doing and my clients, but kind of knew that it was going to be something I'd be at for 3 or 4 years, get that skill set, earn the hours I needed for my clinical licensure exam and my KSAC when I realized I wanted to do that. And that's okay too, right? I made connections there, stayed in touch with folks. I ended up getting a secondary fee-for-service job at a mental health clinic because I was at a substance use clinic. At the time I needed the funds, also got that additional skill set of working in a mental health clinic, which here in New York State is separated from the substance use clinics, both by licensure and by oversight at the state level. So really was able to, and that helped me with my private practice that I later started, having that kind of mental health clinic experience versus just a substance use clinic. So I think, again, going back to being a little open-minded, but also like recognizing like what you're doing and what is it serving for you at that time.
Yeah, getting to understand what the culture is like before you accept a position is really important, because if it's wrong, if the fit's not right, you're not going to want to be there for very long. And that's also where your secondary network can be really helpful too. Like, do you know somebody who knows somebody who works there? Because that also can sometimes give you that salary information that you need to know. Maybe you can get the information about who's going to be interviewing you and some insight of what maybe some topics to bring up. The other piece of advice that I would absolutely say for your first job is make sure you negotiate that first salary, because so many people do not. And if you do end up staying at that particular organization for any amount of time, that first salary is going to dictate a lot of things, whether that's your 401k, the amount of money you're bringing in, and then having a good sense before you're starting the job market about what's necessary in a social work position. Do you have a lot of student debt? I know we don't want to talk about that, but do you have to be in an organization that qualifies for loan forgiveness? Do you need to be in an organization that has a certain amount of time off? Maybe you're planning to start a family. What's the parental time leave look like, right? Those sort of things are really important to know, especially early on in a career. Lots of great advice there. So I've got one more question before we're going to break into smaller groups, so folks can ask some questions. This has gone by so quickly. What are some of the other factors that may have impacted your ability to be successful in your social work journey so far? We've mentioned self-care a little bit, mentoring a little bit, but what are those other things that you would say are essential to be thinking about as you begin your social work journey?
One thing I was thinking, Dwayne, and I'm so glad you brought up negotiating a salary. I think I never learned how to negotiate a salary. When I was going to get my master's in social work, we never really spoke about that, and it wasn't even something we discussed. I think for me early on, I accepted, the salaries I got, especially when I was getting jobs, to get my licensing hours, wanted to get in there and get my licensing hours. I have negotiated successfully and not as successfully before. So I think, I know there was a question in the chat box about resources for negotiating salaries. I don't know if NASW has any particular resources, because that's one thing I think I even can learn more about that myself. It's not something that is easy for me to do necessarily.
And NASW does has resources. I'm going to drop some into the chat. We've had a couple of other sessions. Actually, the one a couple of months ago was on cover letters, resumes, all that stuff, but also early career and some of the things you need to be thinking about. But getting numbers, some of the data is out there in terms of salaries, depending on what state you're in. Other states have very little data, like Michigan does not have very much data at all about our salary ranges. And so that may vary depending on where you are across the country. But we know women are less likely to negotiate than men, and our field is 80–85% women, and we already have salary discrepancies in social work. And so the more we can really encourage folks and empower folks with some skills to know what's fair in a position in your region. And that's, again, going back to that secondary network. You know, if you know somebody who works there, or if it's a nonprofit, you might be able to look at GuideStar for like financial information for an organization. There are some creative ways that you can find some salary things, but I'll put some other resources into the chat. Other folks, what are some other factors or things that have been helpful for your career success?
I've tried not to burn any bridges, which maybe is, seems like simple advice, but I see it happen at different times. And I left the center the first time on my own choice, left on good terms, wanted to return. And if you don't want to return someplace, well, maybe that's the case, but that might change in the future. So really, again, kind of staying open-minded around things. I would say, I think Robert someone mentioned being boundaried. Maybe everyone's kind of talking about boundaries at different points. And I think it's okay. Like I see it, I saw it for myself when I was younger and in school and starting out, and I see it with some of our interns, right? Like it's okay to have your life outside of your social work career. It's okay to have other interests. It's important, right? Like I always use the example of the airplane, dropping down, like you have to put the mask on yourself before you help the person next to you. So if you're tired and burnt out and exhausted, like you're not going to be helping the folks you work with, you're not going to be helping your clients or community. So really, like it's not a bad thing to say no to some things, to take that time to shut the computer off, especially as we blur a lot of times hybrid work these days, right? We're all on a Zoom right now. So just keeping those things in mind as well. And just on the salary piece, I want to throw in, because this is something that I've discovered for myself as I've moved through the career. As you move up in positions, keep in mind, like I have an aspect of being able to influence what our salary ranges are for new roles as they come in through grants, through grant writing. Have that voice, be that person, be like, you know what, like we shouldn't have the same salary for this role that we had in the grant 6 years ago. It needs to reflect inflation and everything else and what we can pay. And if that means we only hire 2 people versus 3 for this grant, and that means we only hire 2 people. And if we don't get the grant with 2 people, then maybe we shouldn't have the grant. So again, as you move through your career, there might be some folks here who have been in their careers a while. How can you influence also salary?
Yeah, that's great advice. And maybe we'll take Brianna's question in the chat to the group before we break into our individual rooms. Brianna asked, how did everyone find their first internship and entry-level position? I know some of you talked about that. Was it through a friend of a friend, through a job posting online, teacher? How'd you all get that first position?
So I'll go first, but before I do that, I do want to say, like, one of the things just negotiating wise to think about is pre-negotiate your promotion. So when you get your license, what's the raise going to look like? So I would have that conversation even at the very beginning, because essentially what people don't always realize, they charge more, right, when they bill when you're licensed. So there should be a benefit to that. So I would talk about, say, I understand I'm not licensed yet. What will that look like? What are my promotion opportunities? Have those conversations up front, because I think we assume they'll take care of us. And then we get there and there's like, oh, there's no budget for that. And then you're angry and trying to look for another job. So that would be just my one piece of advice when you're negotiating. Think about those kinds of things up front. If they're not going to provide supervision, will they give you time off so you can go to supervision? Those 2 or 3 hours that you can go if you're going to pay on your own becomes a benefit. Can you do it if it's via Zoom during the workday? All of those things just to negotiate up front. That there are some things that are just non-monetary that you can also negotiate. But as for my first job, it was through a friend who had worked at this agency in St. Pete, somebody who I'd gone to grad school with, had worked there previously, got to go into grad school. And so it was networking that got me that interview, my first one.
My position was at a community mental health center specifically for children. That's what I did through my internship at school. And the position was a brand new position that was created by the governor. So it just was a smooth transition for me.
And like Tara, my first job was working in a community mental health agency. I particularly looked for one where I get my licensing hours, and I found out about this agency through my school when I was at UCLA, and then also through others that were applying for jobs as well. We kind of connected. At that time, it took me a while to find my first job. So at the time, I was an apartment manager. I managed my apartment building and also leased apartments. So I was doing that while I was looking for that job. That's okay. I could, have my MSW and still be, leasing apartments and managing my apartment building. But so I took a little time and deferred my loans for a little bit of time and got that job that was a good fit for me. And through UCLA, their career resources.
Yeah, thank you all for that. So we're gonna take the next basically 25 minutes of what's left of our time together to let you all have some more individual time with our panelists today. So we're gonna break into 4 rooms. You're welcome to pop around if you'd like. I'll give a little time after about 7 minutes so everyone knows when we've got about a quarter of the time left. I do want to make sure that folks have on their calendars our next 2 events. Jen had mentioned our virtual career fair on January 21st. And then our next student series is going to be March 16th, and it's going to be a national student networking event. So we hope you'll register and join us for that. Because we will just end at 7:30. So I just want to say thank you to our panelists who are here. You all have been fabulous. Tina, I also worked in housing too, as well, in apartment living back in the day. So it's funny to listen to everybody's stories because you can find these connections with folks you would never know, right? Unless we have these networks to be able to chat with one another. So I'm going to open up the breakout rooms. It'll be listed by our panel's name and the area of their specialty practice section. So please feel free to choose the room and